the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Then he will say to those on his left, Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you? He will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. The sermon today will be delivered by Pastor Lucas, and the title is An Audience with Christ the King.
The grace and peace of Christ be with you all. In this church year, the church has been reading through the Gospel of Matthew and listening to Matthew's story about Jesus, starting with a description of Jesus' ancestors and following through Jesus' birth and then through his ministry, his work with his disciples, right through to the end. And today we are getting close to the end of Matthew's story. Jesus' work with his disciples is almost over. His preaching and teaching is finished, and his ministry among the people is done. Jesus' story is about to turn dark for a little moment as we see him betrayed by one of his close friends, see him arrested, tortured, and killed. But before that happens, there is still time for one last lesson for his disciples. One last lesson, one last moment to share the wisdom of God with them, and one last chance to guide the disciples in their future work. People today often give special importance to someone's last words. We feel that in some sense they sum up that person's life or bring their work to a close. And as Jesus walks towards his death in Jerusalem, he gives these last words to his disciples. He brings together all his work and his mission and his teaching and service and concentrates it all down into this one final parable, this one final story. One day when this is all over, one day when Jesus' death and resurrection are behind us, one day when the story of the world is complete, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, will return. At that time, the Son will come as a king, surrounded by angels, shining in glory and sitting on a royal throne. At that time, it will be clear to the entire world, as all the people of the world come together to sit before Christ's throne, it will be clear to them all who their king is and who their king always was. And this will be a marvelous, marvelous royal event. It may be a little bit hard for people in Taiwan to imagine this type of royal event because we don't have a royal family here in Taiwan. But for those of you who've spent any time in a European country or in a British Commonwealth country where we still have the Queen, you may have a sense of this type of event. As an Australian, I can tell you none of our women's magazines would survive 1 week without a picture of some sort of the royal family on the cover. People are just so fascinated with the royalty, how they spend their lives, what they're wearing, who they're seeing, all these types of things. But it's amazing sometimes to see how widespread this interest can get. A few years ago, England's Prince William and Kate got married, and we saw pictures of people lining the streets, cheering, waving flags, celebrating this royal event. And this wasn't just in England. And go to the next slide. This wasn't just in England. Around the world, it seemed that so many people were also watching and celebrating. It was certainly this way in Australia, and I think the excitement even reached Taiwan a little bit. A few months ago, I was organizing a church service here and trying to choose some hymns for the service, and a Taiwanese friend of mine got really excited when she saw which hymn I had chosen, and she said, "Oh, that's the hymn they sang at William and Kate's wedding." And I was amazed that she even knew who William and Kate were. But this type of excitement that surrounds royal events, and we see this often in other countries. And we can imagine that as people stream across the world to come and see Christ, their King, maybe they have a bit of this excitement as well. Maybe we could imagine ourselves standing there in the crowds, waving our flags, cheering and celebrating. But then this story gets a little bit strange. The king comes, but it's not just for a great celebration. There's a strange act of division going on now, a sorting out of the people. And this looks now a little bit more like an act of judgment. But what's it all about? What's the king judging? It's not very clear. The king brings the people to him and decides where they should go, some to the right, some to the left. But what's the criterion? What's the measure? How is the king making this decision? What's his choice based on? Is it completely random? Is it some kind of fickle, capricious choice? Does it depend on relationships? Who has guanxi with the king? So that some can boast, "Oh, the king, he's a good friend of mine." Is it based on nationality or culture? Maybe as people watch others in front of them being sent to one side or another, they see these two groups standing there awkwardly trying to think about, well, what's going on? What's the decision? They might also start to think, well, what's the difference really between these two groups? What's the difference between them both? Now, if the king had said, well, all you criminals and murderers, off you go to the left, maybe we could understand that. That'd be understandable for us. If the king said, right, all you politicians, off you go to the left, you can go stand over there with the lawyers, then maybe we would nod our heads and think, well, maybe he's got it right to separate some people out. Or if the king divided up people by religion, maybe Christians on one side, non-Christians on the other, or Protestants on one side and Catholics on the other, or those following the Schleitheim Confession on one side and those following the Westminster Confession on the other, or even by gender, male on one side and female, sexuality, homosexual, heterosexual, age, young here, old there, or wealth, rich people on one side, poor people on the other. These are all types of decisions that we could understand. If the king did decide this way, we could understand it fairly easily. Because these are the types of choices that we find important in life. These are the types of divisions we find important. These are all the usual methods that we use to divide people up. If the choice were made according to profession, to criminality or religion or denomination or sexuality or age or social status or wealth, we would nod our heads in understanding because the king would be acting like we do. But none of these measures, none of these are the measure or the criteria that Christ the King uses. That's because for God the Son, none of these points are finally important. None of them are important. We may wonder about this. We might think this is strange. How can this really be? How can it not matter to the king how wealthy you are? That's what society cares about. And how can it not matter to the king what your social position is? That's what we care about. And how can the king not care about your sexuality? That seems to be an important point for lots of people today. And how can the king not even care about what religion you are? Surely this one must be wrong. But here at the end of his teaching, Jesus brings his gospel down to this final, simple point. The final measure of all things is not what you think is important, but what the king thinks is important. And for the king, that final measure is compassion, hospitality, justice, and love for others. Compassion and mercy, justice and love, these are so important that they override everything else. This is amazing news because it turns upside down everything we think we know in the church. In the church, we make heavy demands of people. We give them long contracts or long lists of church laws and regulations that they need to obey if they want to be counted as someone who belongs to Jesus, if they want to be accepted by Christ. But here, in this story, the son, the king, he doesn't care about any of that. For him, a whole different list of questions is important. Have you fed the hungry? Then you belong to me. Have you given the thirsty something to drink? Then you won't lose your reward. Did you welcome and care for a foreigner? Then you are a disciple of Christ. Have you clothed the naked? Then you are joint heirs with the Son. Have you cared for the sick? Then you carry the seal of Christ's approval. Have you visited those in prison? Then you are accepted into glory with the King and with all the saints. To count as one of the saints, to count as one of those who belongs to Jesus. These are the things that matter. These are the things. Compassion, mercy, hospitality, love. Compared to these things, nothing else is really important. Because in these actions, here in this way, we bind together love of God and love of neighbor. Last week we talked a little bit about this. Last week we saw how Jesus shifted our attention away from self-centered behavior, as we might find it in, for example, in things like the Ten Commandments, to the real heart of the law, the real heart, which is to love God and to love others. Jesus takes these two aspects and he holds them together as one heart of the law, as the foundation of our whole faith. Because these two go together, we can't think that we can separate them. We can't think that we can just love God and that's enough. In our life of discipleship, we have to love others also. In the same way, we can't separate out our love for others, especially for the needy, from our love of God. These two also go together. This is the point that Jesus comes back to here. To serve the poor, to help those who suffer, to welcome immigrants, means serving Jesus. It means helping Christ. It means welcoming God. This is a truth that neither group in Jesus' story can really quite believe or understand. The king praises those on his right, the righteous servants, and he welcomes them into his kingdom because they have been compassionate, they have been loving towards the king, helping the king in his times of need. But the group stares at the king, confused, wondering what's going on. What's the king talking about? Now, at this point, we might think that even though the righteous don't really understand what's going on, they would at least have the sense to be quiet about it and not complain. After all, if the king is welcoming you in, if he includes you in his people and gives you a great reward, we shouldn't really complain about it. And if someone wants to give you something nice, You just take it and don't ask too many questions. But here, in their amazing humility, the righteous actually try to correct the king. They try to correct the king. Thank you for your offer, your majesty, they say. But you seem to have made a mistake. You must have us mistaken. You must have us mixed up with someone else. After all, how could they belong to the king? How could they be the king's people? In this world, there are many of us who claim to be followers of God, and we are very clear about telling others who gets to be in and who gets to be out. So these truly righteous people, they've often been told their whole lives by others that they don't deserve to be in, that they haven't met the criteria to be accepted, that they don't measure up. They have the wrong religion. They have the wrong social status, the wrong sexuality. They haven't said the right prayers. They haven't participated in the right church services. They haven't signed off on the right creeds and confessions. They haven't really served the king in the way people in the church understand it. So the last thing these people expect now is to stand in front of the king and be accepted by him. No, you must be thinking of someone else. It wasn't us, they say. And when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or in need? When did we ever come and help you? As for those on the left, they're also very confused. But unlike the righteous, their confusion isn't linked with humility. Instead, it's linked a little bit with anger. Why are we being criticized now? Why are we being held out on the outside for not helping the king? We never saw him in need. We never saw him hungry. We never saw him sick or in prison. And in any case, why is that so important? We had everything else right. We believed the right things. We said the right things. We prayed the right things. We were church members. And we had a spiritual relationship with God. Isn't that enough? Haven't we done enough? Here, Jesus doesn't seem to be using the same set of criteria that we normally do. So what's going on here? Today's text leads us back to a much deeper question. What does it actually mean to be a saint? In the early days of the church, the answer was quite clear. The saints were simply believers, the ones who followed Christ. This is why Paul can speak about the saints in Rome, why Matthew can speak about the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, and the writer of Hebrews can talk about greeting all the saints in the local church. But here we come to a deeper question. These people, these followers of Jesus, do they actually have to be in the church? Do they really have to be in the church? Because of questions like these, the story we shared with the children this morning, the story of the Roman soldier Martin, has been such an important one through the many centuries of the history of the church. Because the story reminds us of the lesson that Jesus is teaching his disciples here in this final lesson. To be a saint, to be a person that really belongs to Christ, this isn't necessarily the same thing as being in the church. There are those who are like an unbaptized Roman soldier, but who still go and serve Christ unknowingly, but in compassion and in love. There are also those outside the church who belong to Christ, but they don't know it. And there are also those outside the church who will be counted as righteous and who are invited to take their royal inheritance with the king simply because they have concentrated on the foundation, on the heart of the law. They opened their hearts to the call of Christ's Spirit and lived lives of compassion, hospitality, mercy, and love. And that's what is most important. That's the key. That's the basis of everything else. John Calvin, who was an important founding figure for our Presbyterian church, he tried to teach us something very similar by speaking about a difference here between the visible and the invisible church. That there is a church around us that we see and one that we don't see. That the church that we see around us is not necessarily the same as the true church of saints that follow Christ. In the same way, what Jesus teaches us in this story is that the number of people who truly belong to him, the number of people that are truly his, is far larger than we may ever imagine. In this final teaching, Jesus really wants us never to forget the importance of loving others, of going into the world and helping those in need. He wants us never to forget how important this work is. But apart from this call for us to remember our responsibilities, this story also contains a wonderful piece of good news for all of us. I've heard church members say before how sad they are that they weren't alive at the time of Jesus. How they wished so much they could have been there together with Jesus, could have been alive at the time of the early church, so that they could go to Galilee as well and see Jesus, meet with Jesus. Maybe you felt this way too. Maybe you felt that if only we had a time machine, or if some magical method, we had some magical way to travel through space and time so that we could go back to those early days, to go back to those old days of the church and be close to Jesus, that would be wonderful. But the good news is, we don't need a time machine. We don't need magical powers to be with Jesus. As Jesus prepares to finally leave his disciples, as he prepares to pass through death, he gives them this last reminder. Do you still want to be near me? Do you still want to be near Christ? Then go and be near those in need. Do you still want to be close to me? Share a meal then with the hungry and the thirsty. Would you love to sit together with your Lord? Then sit together with those who are sick and imprisoned. As Jesus says to us, truly I tell you, we are the same. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did that for me. So invite God into your home by opening your doors to the stranger, to the foreigner. Spend time with God by spending time with the poor and needy. And share your clothes with the cold and the naked. Then one day, like Martin, you'll get to hear the King of all creation praise you before all the angels in heaven and all the saints in heaven and all the peoples of this earth, saying, "This is my righteous servant. This is my beloved friend. This is the one who clothed me. Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." Let's pray together.